G'day. So we're looking at two different species of computer today. Looking at what you can get for your dollars if you didn't have a lot of money to spend on, well, computers. This one here is a MacBook from 2008. It's the first of the aluminium type. It runs a Core 2 Duo. It's been upgraded slightly. It's got 4 gig of RAM. It runs DDR3 and all that sort of fun stuff. And this thing here is a Windows 10 tablet running an Intel Atom chip with 2 gig of RAM because you can't upgrade it. There's a couple of discrepancies in hardware. There's definitely a difference in RAM because this has got the 4 gig. This has got the 2 gig. They're both 64-bit capable processors. This has got the onboard eMMC, which is basically like an SD card built on the main board. This is running a mechanical hard disk, which I don't believe is too big. Yeah, so it's running a 120 gigabyte mechanical drive. This is running 128 gig eMMC. So storage space doesn't matter in this kind of context. Because it has no bearing really on speed-wise. But I guess what this video is about is pretty much that even a 10-year-old computer, which this one actually is, this is a 10-year-old machine. Because we're in 2018 now, and this was released at the end of 2008, so it is officially a 10-year-old computer. Basically what this is about is that computer hardware really hasn't improved to a point so quickly as it used to. If you go back to 2008, if you go back 10 years from then, 10 years back from here, you're talking late Pentium 2s, early Pentium 3s, maybe the AMD K6 series processors and that sort of thing. There was a big difference then. These days, not so much. Now, where this one is still supported on the current OS, this one running El Captain is right at the end of its lifespan. Basically, by the end of this year, this computer officially by Apple is no longer supported. It's at the end of its lifespan. It you know, by rights it should have been dead long ago, but it's still carrying on. Now, if we have a look at the CPUs, I did a quick search on what CPU is in this one. So basically, you got the Core 2 Duo, which is a dual-core 64-bit capable processor, and you've got the Atom chip, which is the Z3770, which is what's in my my ThinkPad tablet. The difference between the two, this is a dual-core at 2 GHz, and this is a quad-core at 1.46, whatever. And you look at the release dates. See, this release date's wrong because this is the chip that's actually in this based on the Mac, one of the Mac websites. So it is a properly old CPU. So ignore this, but it is a properly old CPU. So which means we may not be able to take these results here with a grain of salt. But basically, what they're saying is, just going through this, is that in all aspects of things, the outside of the value side, which whatever, because you're not buying these processors separate, they come with your machines. Outside of all this, the Windows tablet should technically be a faster machine, but it's not. See, if I get, I've been doing a little bit of search. As you can see, I've got a performance monitor up here, and I've also got a performance monitor up here. Now, using the native web browsers, say in this case, to run a YouTube video, which is running in, if we go into your settings here, a 720p video at 60 frames per second. You're playing this locally. I might have to mute it just for copyrighty stuff. But if you look at the performance monitor using the native browser, it's not doing too bad actually. It's using, you know, sort of sitting around just under half of the processor's capabilities. Now, if I go over to say Google Chrome, which is a apparently a more capable browser anyway, and I do the same thing and hit play on the same video, you watch the performance monitor, and you get a bit of stuttering. You'll start noticing a bit of stuttering in the video playback. And you can see here that the performance on, say in this case, Google Chrome, is pegging it pretty close to full on anyway. But as you can see, that issue can be alleviated by running the built-in browser. Now, this performance stuff isn't specific to the Mac OS. On Windows, even Windows 10 on a Core 2 Duo, the performance is very, very capable, provided you've either got the graphics subsystem to run it, which when Core 2 Duos came out would have been one of the earlier Intel HD graphics, or say in this thing's case, which is running an NVIDIA 9400. Which it runs quite happily, because if your video processing can leverage your graphics CPU, or your graphics GPU, sorry, it'll run at it'll run quite happily with running this sort of video. It does, I believe at this point H.264 wasn't completely available, so the built-in hardware acceleration support for H.264, or MPEG-4 as it's otherwise known, wasn't always built in. Though, see, if I go over to this device here, which is also running a, well, it's running a base level Intel chip. If I go over to, let's get out of a couple of things here. Yeah, I am doing this handheld, unfortunately, but it's got to be because life and issues. Now, this is the Microsoft Edge browser. So if I start playing the same video in the same 1080, watch over here. This is the CPU performance use. So that's running the Edge browser, and we're, you know, it runs fine in this kind of case. I go over to Chrome and do the same thing, and we've obviously got the same issue here where we're running the CPU pretty close to pegged. It seems to be a common issue. I mean, Google Chrome and even Mozilla Firefox do push these machines' hardware too far, especially based on what the machines are capable of. But what we have also, even just basic system performance things. I mean, notwithstanding the fact that this thing here, the MacBook, and by the way, again, this doesn't have anything to do from if I had a Core 2 Duo based Windows laptop here, I'd have it out, but I don't. I've only got the MacBook out at the moment. But the issue is the same deal. Launching programs, getting into things, is more or less the same sort of deal. And you look at the difference between these two. The CPU for this was released in 2014. The CPU for this was released in 2008. And apparently between the two of them, the Bay Trail Atom in this should be quicker, but it's not. So even over 6 years' time, between that machine and this machine, things haven't progressed. I mean, you go up further levels as time progressed. When this came out, you've got your i3s, i5s, i7s, and that sort of thing on the newer architectures. But you know, for this thing here to still be released 6 years after this one, with a processor whose performance is the same as this one here, give or take, yeah, but more or less the same sort of deal. The only real advantages between this whole thing and this one here is power usage. I mean, this can run on its built-in battery for a good 8 to 12 hours. Well, it could when it was new. This one here could probably do the same deal when it was new. But the difference is the battery in this thing is huge. It's basically this whole machine here internally. Well, okay, it's not. It's about there to there. and the other bits left over for the hard drive. But it's a pretty decent amount of thing. And this thing's pretty look, it's a properly heavy machine with active cooling and everything. Where this has got internally, the cooling for this thing's a copper sheet, not much thicker than a piece of cardboard, across the back plastic. So that's where your differences really come into it. In that sort of time span, but performance-wise, they're not too dissimilar. The only reason this thing here is technically obsolete is because the OS for this one actually becomes unsupported at the end of this year. Though once it is unsupported, this has got a 64-bit EFI BIOS in it, which means it can quite happily run it'll run Windows 10 natively without any issues. With full support for all the hardware, except maybe a bit of fun trickery with the trackpad, which I think is kind of common with running Windows on MacBooks. But I believe Apple did release Windows drivers for this because they do have Boot Camp. So that's kind of a funny thing. This whole machine here, even though it is now 10 years old, is still capable of running your social media stuff, your YouTube, your entertainment things, watching videos. I think, yeah, it even has the DVD drive if you're into that sort of thing. And with an SSD upgrade on this, you could put a $30 120 gig SSD into this thing and it'd fly. You could chuck basically anything at it and it'll play it. And it'll happily run the current version of Windows 10. At least until Windows 10 stops supporting Core 2 Duos, which I don't think is going to happen for a while now. But yeah, I mean, between the two of them, they're not too dissimilar internally, really. And performance-wise, there's not a great deal in it. And yet this here is only 4 years old, and it does struggle. The 2 gigabytes of RAM probably doesn't help. But unfortunately, it's not upgradable. This machine here is running a processor that's so far out of date that, well, Apple aren't going to support it. And I think the only reason they aren't going to support it is the fact that it's just an old machine. I mean, this is the aluminium one that, if we close it down, one-handed, get the smokes out of it. This is the one that you could actually pull the cover off and get access to your hard drive and your battery. This was the removable battery version. We can pull that out. That is the battery. That's not going to happen anymore. See, this is it's one of Apple's most serviceable units. Pop them in there, put the cover back on, and off you go again, you know. But yeah, see, don't discredit old hardware. Things haven't progressed to that point at the moment where a machine 3 or 4 years old is useless. Sometimes all it needs is a new hard drive and maybe a bit of extra RAM. RAM's not expensive if it's current generation or last generation. And this being DDR3, or this would have actually been the first of the DDR3 machines. DDR3 is now currently last generation, which is pretty full on considering it's 10 years old. And it's still readily available. You can upgrade this thing for next to nothing. You know, 2 gigabyte sticks, you can buy them secondhand for like $5 or $10 a piece. A $35 SSD in this, and it's a fully capable machine. You chuck Windows 10 on, it'll play YouTube, no dramas. Or even Mac OS El Capitan, which, you know, while it is end of life, provided browsers like Google Chrome or Firefox or any other derivatives still support it, it'll still run fine. But yeah, things haven't gotten that much quicker, really. Well, maybe that's the wrong way of saying it. Things haven't gotten that much slower compared to how they would have 5 or 10 years ago under the same time span. A lot's changed. See, you go back 5 years, what's that, 2003, 2013, sorry, and then go back 10 years behind that into the 2003 territory, and we're talking end-of-life Pentium 3s and your Pentium 4s. or even in that time span, the original AMD Athlon 64 chips. They came out 2002, 2003, I think I saw them in mainstream. So you go back 15 years to go between 15 years ago and 5 years ago. That difference in change between there and there was phenomenal. Things went from straight 32-bit single core to actually, I think there was still a lot of single core stuff happening right at the end of that point in 2013, although everything else has just migrated to dual core at least. There was still some really cheap Celerons and cheap Athlon, their Sempron brand chips around then. But see, things went from 32 to 64-bit, single core to multi-core, and a few other things. And then SSDs came in. So just watching the progression, 10 years ago isn't as bad as it was 5 years to 15 years ago. It's a big discrepancy. So, see, I guess the biggest thing to take from this is a laptop you buy even 5 years ago, or a laptop you own that's 5 years old, with a couple of dollars spent on it for even just a straight SSD and a couple of gigs of RAM, will still be more than happy to do all everyday tasks, except for gaming, because that's where your changes are happening. But general use, Facebook, YouTube, Twitters, Word, Excel, or if you're in the Apple world, Pages and Sheets or whatever. Numbers. Sheets is Google's Docs. But all that sort of thing. The changes aren't as big as they used to be. It's actually pretty cool. I'm liking this sort of thing. See, this here was disowned by its owner about a year ago. And I've had it since, and I only use it for just to have around. So if I need to fix Apple-related equipment, I can plug the drives out of those into this and do the little service work I need to do, or use this as a transfer path from one system to another or whatever. That's all this is really for. So as long as it keeps doing that, I don't care too much. But it is still a very capable machine, and at some point I'll chuck Boot Camp or whatever and put Windows 10 on it and just see how it behaves. It might actually be a pretty decent Windows 10 machine, because I know a lot of the older Dell machines that I get through work with the Core 2 Duos, especially the ones, even the ones that came with Vista licenses, using a spare 7 licenses kicking around and then upgrading it through to Windows 10. Those machines handle Windows 10 flawlessly with a 128 gig SSD and 3 or 4 gig of RAM. They do it quite well. As long as the CPU is a 64-bit chip, generally means it's at least a native dual core, not one of those early P4 dual things that came out. And they are still very capable. And the best thing is, even with your desktop machines in the same era, a simple video card, and you've got your H.264 support native in hardware, and they'll run happy every day. It's crazy, but that's where we're at.